So welcome to creating default subobjects. What we're going to do in this video is we're going to add an aiming component to our tank blueprint, but we're going to add it in C++ code, so it comes up here whether you kind of like it or not. You won't even be able to remove it, or the designer won't. And then we're going to delegate down our behavior, our aiming behavior, to this component. So let's see how that's done. So let's talk about the architecture of this puppy. We have already done the whole top of this now, the top up to the tank. We have both the controllers reporting where they're aiming at and the tanks receiving those. What we're going to do, mainly as an option to show you other ways of doing things for the moment, is we're going to delegate that behavior straight out to a tank aiming component rather than dealing with it in the tank. In reality, as you're building up a project, you may well just bungle this in the tank and then later decide, well, actually some of this could be easily moved out into a separate class, especially if you were going to reuse that aiming component, perhaps as a more general aiming component like a mortar or something like that. But I'm going to go straight to separation into an aiming component because I want to show you the delegation process. You'll see that in the engine. You'll see it all over the place. And it works here. It works much better when we talk about the movement, which you'll see later on when we do all the tank movement. But we'll be ending up doing movement and aiming in exactly the same way. We'll have an aiming component and a movement component, and it'll all be on level ground in that respect. So it's an architectural decision. There are lots of ways of approaching this, but we're going to stick with this for this section. And what it means is that we're going to have on the tank here, we're going to add a component, but rather than adding a blueprint component and then perhaps choosing actor component, don't do this, by the way. We're not even going to do that. We're not even going to do it by adding a C++ component. We're actually going to do this directly in script. We're actually going to add the component in the constructor of the tank, because the tank is going to require the tank aiming component. It does require the tank aiming component if it's going to delegate aiming to it. And I'm going to show you how to add these things in code. So that means that your designer basically can't break the requirement by removing the tank aiming component, for example. All right, and that will make sure all your code runs together. So it's a pretty cool technique. So the first thing we're going to need to do in our tank.h then is to actually make ourselves a space for these aiming components. Now I'm going to put this in the protected section. Why protected? Well, it can't be private because we are going to need to access it using a U property later, and it's not going to be allowed to be private. We're going to compile an error, and it doesn't need to be public because who needs access to this component from the outside? This is the tank's business that it is using a separate aiming and movement component. So we're going to start in protected. So we create ourselves a protected section, and then we're going to make ourselves a tank movement component pointer. But of course, the tank movement component does not exist yet as a class. So let's start by making that class. Over in your content world outliner, so content browser rather, C++ classes, you can add a new C++ class. Now, the question is, what's it going to be? Well, which of these things that are on my screen now do you think it's going to be before I tell you? The ones that are highlighted: character, pawn, actor, actor component, or scene component, if we're making a tank aiming component. Hopefully you guessed that it should be actor component because it's a component on an actor. So remembering that a pawn is also an actor and that a tank is a type of pawn, which is a type of actor, you've got to love inheritance. So we're going to make an actor component, and it's going to be called tank aiming with a G component without an I. Okay, so we create the class tank aiming component. Just let that happen, and then we can go back to the tank and we can start talking about do the include that we need to do, and then we can create ourselves a pointer to a tank aiming component, because of course without the class none of that is possible. But let's just get the boilerplate code even, have a look and see what the boilerplate code looks like. Here it is, tank aiming component.h. It's done all this for us, and tank aiming component.cpp. Cool. So importantly, we're going to need to hash include the tank aiming component.h, just like we do in the CPP. For the tank aiming component, we're going to need to do this in the tank, aren't we? And we're going to need to do it in the tank.h because we're going to want to reference it in the tank.h. Now, remember that you can't be below the tank generator.h. It's just a rule. You must paste new classes above this. I may make a note here. Paste, put, probably better because you're not always pasting, but in this case I'm going to do a paste with some quotes. Oh, I didn't need that, did I? I took the whole thing. There you go. Include tank aiming component.h. So that means that the tank now has a concept of this tank aiming component.h. This means that in the protected section we can say u tank aiming component. Remember, it's named it like that for us here. U tank aiming component pointer So we want to store a pointer to it, and we can call it tank aiming component. And that should be the null pointer to start with, just to initialize it to something sensible and predictable, if not desirable. Okay, cool. So we have now, the tank has the ability to have a reference to a tank aiming component now. So over in the tank CPP, up in its constructor, then we're going to look about adding this from code. Now, we don't need to protect the pointers because it's adding in the constructor and it's very likely to fail. So no need to protect pointers as added at construction. Make a note about that before I do it. So we want the tank movement component, sorry, aiming component. Where's my variable gone? Tank aiming component. It just hasn't popped through yet. The IntelliSense, as usual, is being very slow. So tank aiming component equals. Now, this is the new method for you. It's called create default subobject. So let's use that. Create default sub object. And then you give it a type. It's a generics type. So in the brackets here, we're going to put the type. And then we're going to give it an F name in the circular brackets. So the type is utank aiming component. There you go. Something that the IntelliSense is working on. And then the argument we need to pass is an F name. And we give it a name. And we can call it the aim component or aiming component. Like that. Now you'll see what that F name does in a moment. You'll see how it appears in the hierarchy. Let's go ahead and see if this will compile. We've got a lot of Visual Studio warnings, but I'm thinking they're probably all just Visual Studio having a hissy fit about nothing in particular. So let me see if I can get to the compile button. My compile button has completely disappeared in Unreal, so I'm just going to close and reopen Unreal. I have seen that happen before. If it ever happens to you, the first port of call is just to close and reopen your Unreal editor. Okay, there it is, back, compile button. Unless I didn't see it before, but I think I didn't. All right, so that's now triggering Visual Studio to compile this code, which might force it into submission in terms of these errors. Either that or there is some error here, but I can't see it, so... Okay, there is some error. Let's take a look and see what it is. Create default subobject is undeclared. So the question is, have I spelt that wrong? Yeah, it's a small o on the subobject. I believe that's my problem. Let's recompile. So the code you want is this. Create default subobject like that with a small o. Let it compile, see if there are any more errors. Compile complete. Now, if we go look at the tank now, let's go have a look at the tank blueprint. See how it's looking. Ah, look at that. At the top of the tank blueprint, we have aiming component inherited. We can't currently see any details on it, and we can change that if we wish to. But you have the component added there at construction time, so it's already there before we even play the game. Now, talking about playing the game, we probably should play the game just to make sure that it's not broken. It seems to be fine. Everything that was happening before is happening now, but the tank has a pure C++ aiming component that it calls there inherited, which is exactly what we want. So it's challenge time. I want you to move the aiming logs, the things that are giving us our logs about where we're pointing, to the new component. Move them, don't copy them, so that they're in one new place and we can be sure it's working. Obviously recompile your code and make sure that the message still gets through to the log. And when you've done that, and just take a step back and ensure that you're comfortable with what's happening overall, and then I'll show you quickly how I do that, and then we'll end the video. So see you in a moment. So welcome back. Let's take a look and see what's happening here. So previously in the tank C++, we have got some logs. Here you go, aim_at, and the aim_at is just logging out directly. It's getting the tank name and it's logging out. So let's take that code, so it's no longer there, and let's add it into the tank aiming component. And then we need to make ourselves a new tank aiming a new aim_at method in this subcomponent. So before I do that, I'm just going to paste that code back. If you ever cut code and then think you're going to do something and then realize that you're not quite ready to use it and it's left in the paste buffer, put it back where you left it for a moment, because otherwise you could end up with it, you'll reuse your copy buffer and lose your code, right? So it's pretty obvious computer use stuff, that, but definitely worth mentioning. Okay, so over in the tank aiming component, I'm going to get rid of the AI controller for a minute. Over in the aiming component, we're going to need a new method. So this is going to be a public method. Telling the aiming component to aim is a candidate for being a public method. So void aim_at, and then we're going to say, well, we're going to aim at some f vector, And let's give it a variable name for now, just kind of for commenting purposes. You don't need it here in the .h file, but world space aim. And this thing is going to tell the tank to start aiming at a particular world space aim. Pretty self-explanatory. So let's make that method over here in the implementation. Just grab the class name and decorate it with that. And then just pop in and implement. Now, that's fine. So we now have an aim at in there, which means that from the tank, instead of doing this logging, we can do the following. We can say, we can get the tank aiming component, which we should have now, down here as tank aiming component. So let's say tank aiming component. Now that's a pointer. And then we should be able to go aim at, and then this hit location. Which means that the log can come from here down to the tank aiming component there. The only problem is we're not just going to be able to get the name of the component, we need to get the owner, get name, which means from a hierarchy point of view, we're in the aiming component, we're going to come up to the tank itself and then get its name. Okay, so that's what I'm proposing we do. The only thing is that we've got world space aim as a name coming in here and then hit location there. Let's change it all to hit location. So I'm going to change the signature to hit location and the same here. So we're going to aim at a particular hit location. That makes just as much sense. And there it is. All right, now let's compile and see if this makes it all the way down to the new component that's automatically added in code. And if it does, that's great. We can focus on tanky stuff at the tank and we can focus on aiming specific stuff in the aiming component. While this recompiles, oh no, it's done. I'll just carry on. Here we go. Oh, look, that works. Now, just to convince ourselves that that's definitely working here, let's just double check that the tank has saved. There are no stars. There's no logs in the tank. The only logs are here. So it is being logged from the aiming component. That's it. Congratulations. We've got that done.